ሩብ ጉዳይ ሩብ ጉዳይ ለ8 15 ደቂቃ ተነሽ ተነሽ
መጀመሪያ ላይ ነው
ገባኝ ግን ማየት አለብን አቃበል አይዞን እሺ እሺ
So a lack of understanding of how that regime works. What you've done is decapitated the leader. It is a system which is built to withstand this kind of decapitation. They've been making plans for this since well before last June, the last time they attempted to assassinate the Ayatollah. It is a defused regime, and they have gone underground. There is a deep state there. And so it is going to be very hard now for the U.S. and Israel to what? Strike a system. And what is Iran's strategy? As long as they can hold out, they feel like they are winning. So the president has an objective of a regime change, but no plan in place and no understanding of this regime to accomplish that. And there's not much Congress can do. This is all up to the midterms, because unless Democrats take the House and potentially the Senate, there's nothing that's going to happen that will rein in this president, who, by the way, in just the last month and a half, has taken out the leaders of 2 foreign countries. And guess who's next? Cuba. This is a president who's making his name on that. And it is not only unconstitutional, it should be alarming to anybody who believes in democracy that one person, to Representative Dean's point, has the ability to make these kinds of decisions and take us all into a war he and we are unprepared for.
And does it not also run counter to what President Trump said he would do in office? He promised peace, no more wars. Now he's talking today about the likelihood of more American casualties, Rick.
Yeah, there's no question that you're running afoul of the rhetoric politically that, he's used really since his, preeminence into the political stage in, 2015. America First does not include raids on foreign countries like this. But at the end of the day, the realities of the presidency dictate the politics. It's not the other way around. So, yes, he's going to probably stir the pot inside of MAGA, as if it hasn't already had a lot of pot stirring in the 1 year he's been president so far. There have been a lot of issues, a lot of MAGA podcasters and others talking about this today in opposition to this. But I think that you've got to look at it from a broader point of view. He's never going to be on another ballot, right? Does he want MAGA? Does he want MAGA to succeed in the future? Sure, but he's not going to diminish his role as commander-in-chief and as president of the United States to make a political calculation as to whether this is good for me. I mean, at the end of the day, the person who seems to really be at the short end of the stick is the vice president, not even included in the run-up to this attack in Iran. Sitting in the command center in the White House while everybody else is in Mar-a-Lago controlling the outcome. He's going to have some explaining to do, because he does have a future that he's interested in politically, and it includes getting MAGA on his side. Where is he on this?
Adam, our listeners and viewers should know that you were a spokesperson for the National Security Council in the Biden administration. I'm curious your take on the way this has been communicated. That was your job, to deliver the message, the decision, the rationale. So far, there's been no Oval Office address. We got a video in the middle of the night where the president was wearing a ball cap, and then we got the updated video today. Same podium down at Mar-a-Lago, wearing a suit and tie, a slightly different vibe, but no interaction, no sort of formal address. Is this the way we do things now?
Well, it's the way we do things in some respects, but I take a step back. I think it's a missed opportunity. On Wednesday, the president had 30-odd million people watching the State of the Union, and he didn't really lay out a strategy. Rick, you'll remember when George Bush was leading us into the war in Iraq, he at least asked for a joint session of Congress and spoke to the American people about what his vision was. And so I think that's why there is an increased both tail risk for America's security, but I think there's a tail risk for the president's politics, because he has not made the case effectively for what's in it for the American people. And comments like, that's the way it is when talking about people's lives that are lost. That's not going to ring too great for the husbands, the wives, the sons, the daughters who aren't coming back from this war in Iraq.
Or on the script.
It may, but again, that gets to the messaging of why you put the president. It may have been, but it gets again to why you put the president behind the Resolute desk, offering a clear, concise message for what is in it for the American people, and he has failed to do that so far.
Well, when we consider the American people, Jeannie, a new poll, a snap poll really out from Morning Consult in the aftermath of these strikes was interesting. It found that basically the nation is split as to whether or not the strikes were necessary on Iran. But when you start talking about the economic vulnerability that they could create, 63% said they are concerned about gas prices. And when those costs were made explicit, only 18% favor continuing involvement. Ultimately, I know you were talking about how Congress can't act as a check here. Can political and economic reality perhaps provide a check?
Yeah, Kaylee, and I think that is the only check we have left on this president, and his intention to expand executive power is going to come down to public opinion and, to your point, to the markets, because those are the things we've seen him, at least to a certain extent, listen to. And the poll by Morning Consult, while it is a snap poll, those are devastating numbers for the president. And of course, as Rick mentioned, he's not on the ballot, so it's really devastating for Republicans on the ballot. And by the way, voting starts on Tuesday way in North Carolina and Texas. And, you know, just to go back for a minute, if the president and the administration really want to change the regime in Iran, you've got to take the people of Iran with you. And yet, what did they do? Not only hasn't he shared with us what the objective is or taken us along, they cut Voice of America. Soft power matters in these things. The people of Iran today, you know what they're watching? They're watching that the United States and Israel bombed school children and killed them. That's all they're seeing because, in their infinite wisdom, Carrie Lake, who's in charge of Voice of America, has decided to destroy that. This is a regime in the United States that has run amok of its own stated purposes. And that's an enormous problem if his real goal is to help the Iranian people and to change that regime.
We've only got about a minute left, Rick. Crude oil futures are going to be opening with other futures contracts in just a couple of moments. How big of a story is this going to be if we see what Clayton suggested, the potential for $90, $100 a barrel oil?
Yeah, I think it's still very early in this exercise to make predictions as to what the Strait of Hormuz is going to be like a week from now. You still have more attacks that are going to occur both by Iran and by the coalition of the U.S. and Israel. So I think it's still wait and see. You know, I do remember during the Gulf War, we thought, oh my God, this is going to seize oil programs, and it didn't. So I don't think a prediction today is necessary because we don't know how this is going to resolve itself.
Yep.
Markets hate uncertainty.
We certainly don't. All right, Rick Davis, Adam Hodge, Jeannie Shanzano, thank you for joining us. Futures open in just a few moments, so stick with coverage right here on Bloomberg.
Know how the market day started.
Find out how it finishes.
Public markets to private markets.
From the micro to the macro.
Covering retail, entertainment, the business of sports.
The supply chains, trade policy, how it all is impacting the U.S. equity market as we drive to the closing bell at 4 p.m.
A holistic approach to covering financial markets.
If it matters to your life, we're covering it. I'm Katie Greifeld.
And I'm Romaine Bostic, and this is The Close.
Every weekday from 3 to 5 Eastern.
Only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Peru is maybe first country inspired to me to how can I use the different ingredients. First time I went to Peru, trying to culture food. I never had this ingredients never used in Japan. Kind of like a wow, you know, and cilantros, chili, garlic, and olive oils. So a lot of good seafoods, complete a different way. Example, they have the fresh fish. But Japan, the fresh fish uses sashimi. But Peru use fresh fish, make it called ceviche, cooked with the lemon juice. You never use the soy sauce. First time.
Moment of truth, ladies and gentlemen. Ten seconds. What are we expecting? Markets. ええ
Time I eat
in terms of the Brent price right now. I'm just looking across not just the May contract, which is now trading at 81. Across the curve, we are up clearly across the curve. It's really the near-end contract that's seeing the most substantial moves to the upside. Although as I speak, and this is important, as I speak, we are pairing the initial move higher, this knee-jerk reaction in markets, just to note that as well. Now, just a caveat too, this is no indication that we did see the peak in oil prices at the get-go. Other things we're tracking, gold, that's also coming up right now. I'm looking at my screens right now, and we're looking at gold futures now trading at 53.40 on gold. Spot gold is also very much in focus. And just keep in mind, in terms of the all-time highs on spot itself, we just under 55. So we're nowhere near those levels, but substantially higher than we were trading on Friday going into this weekend. And as you can see, precious metals are bid, U.S. futures are down, and it does seem that markets will really need some support right now. Broad move cross asset is one clearly of risk aversion, guys.
For markets, as you guys mentioned, is really going to be about the duration of this conflict. Kaylee, let's bring you in here. Are we getting any indication from the Trump administration how long this might last? There's been some suggestion that it might be for 4 weeks. Is this realistic to expect?
Well, that's what the president told the Daily Mail, that he expects that this could be about a 4-week-long operation, as he told the nation once again in a video statement posted to Truth Social this afternoon before departing his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida to return back here to Washington. He says these operations will continue until, quote, all of our objectives are achieved. The difficulty at this hour is that there is not a clear understanding of what exactly those objectives are. Is the U.S. simply trying to take out Iran's ballistic missile capabilities? Is this about targeting the nuclear program, or is this actually about regime change, knowing that this has been to some degree a decapitation strike as well, taking out the supreme leader? And in that same video, the president called on the Iranian people. He says, if you yearn for freedom, seize this moment, be brave, be bold, take back your country. He suggested that he fulfilled a promise to the American people in taking this, or the Iranian people rather, in taking this action. But he says, quote, the rest will be up to you, though he noted that the U.S. will be there to help. And that is going to be a question as well, even once active combat operations have wrapped up. And again, that could be a matter of days, it could be weeks, perhaps longer. What role will the U.S. still be playing going forward? And what role will Congress have to play, if any, in that? As we have spoken within the last hour here on Bloomberg TV and radio to members of Congress from both parties who are on conflicting sides as to whether or not a war powers vote is necessary for the president to continue to authorize the military to be used in this way. Democrats contend that it was unconstitutional to launch these strikes in the first place, that the president does need to consult and get the approval of Congress for them to continue, while Republicans largely are supportive of this president and his actions. So it's unclear whether or not it actually is something that could pass. But that is still going to be a conversation that dominates here in Washington in the weeks ahead, as the president warns that more American casualties could be coming.
Kaylee, there are just so many questions. The most important ones you've canvassed there as to what comes next. You know, what exactly is that US presence and role going to be going forward beyond this initial strike? But Abir, I do wonder from where you sit, do we know what is going on in Iran, what is happening when it comes to succession of leadership, when it comes to, you know, the people that President Trump are calling on to kind of seize the moment?
Yeah, hi. So, I mean, as of now, the way things stand is a succession plan is not in place, right? There is no clear successor yet. But the body that President Trump said he will talk to, he told The Atlantic earlier today that he will talk to Iran. That body is comprised of the president, the head of judiciary in Iran, and a jurist from the Guardian Council. So those three members are now running the country. But even with that, I brought to the table before this attack that came against Oman. Now, the Gulf countries have been facing this relentless retaliation from Iran over the past 48 hours. But Oman in particular is interesting because it is the country that has been mediating these talks between the U.S. and Iran over the past couple of weeks. Only 2 days ago, they were sat at the table. But what the president of Iran, what the foreign minister of Iran had come out and said is that right after that attack against Iran, against Oman that happened earlier in the Duqm port, he said that he assured his counterpart in Oman that that was not something they were aware of, that was the armed forces acting in somewhat of an isolation. So you've got that risk of the armed forces in Iran acting in isolation. But what we also know is that President Trump's demands or President Trump's urging of the Iranian people to stand against their government haven't yet materialized. So once Khamenei has been confirmed to be dead in the early hours of this morning, a lot of people came out in mass protests in Iran. Some people were coming out in jubilation. Some other people were mourning his death. But what we haven't seen is President Donald Trump's demands or President Donald Trump's urging of the Iranian people to go up and go against the government happening on the ground or coming to fruition.
Abir, what do we know about the sort of military assets that Iran has at this stage and how long they can keep up all this military action for?
So one thing that is a consensus on the ground, and particularly when it comes to the Gulf states, is what we've seen over the past 48 hours is certainly not the 12-day war that we've seen in June. The attacks that Iran have launched against members of the GCC, those include the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, against what was more than just military bases, U.S. military bases. We've seen Iran targeting civilian infrastructure. I mean, you're seeing the images there. I think that is in Dubai, in some of the affluent neighborhoods in Dubai. What we know is that perhaps President Donald Trump's and Israel's attack against Iran came at a time where they thought that Iran was not as prepared for this war. But what we're seeing, the retaliation, just the numbers that we've seen being launched in missiles and drones against GCC countries have been palpable. Hundreds of missiles launched against them, but we don't know for sure what Iran's left-in capabilities is.
Kaylee, I'm so curious as to how this is playing out in the US, both when it comes to the popular vote. We know that President Trump has been struggling with approvals both within his base and also more broadly. How does this play into his campaign promises of no more wars, of more isolationist foreign policy, and of getting inflation down? Just ahead of the summer driving season, we could see gas prices spike.
Yeah, it was just last Tuesday the president in his State of the Union address was touting low gasoline prices. And clearly with the big move we're seeing in oil futures at the opening of trading here, that is likely something that is going to change in the near term. Now, we know that President Trump is not able to seek re-election himself, but this is going to be a major factor for his party heading into these midterm elections. For Republicans, especially those who are in vulnerable seats that could swing either way, who have to defend the economic track record of this administration. So much economically and in terms of oil is going to be really how this a deciding factor into how this plays politically. I would note that when we consider what the U.S. military has been undertaking over the last 24, 48 hours, in part, and the president has said this, they are targeting Iran's Navy. We have already sunk in 9 Iranian naval vessels. The president said we will continue until the Navy is taken out entirely. And the suggestion, if you speak to analysts, is that that actually may be an action intended to make sure that the Strait of Hormuz can continue to be navigable for oil cargoes. We know a fifth of them, in terms of the oil flows around the world, go through the Strait of Hormuz. So that may be the U.S. trying to make sure that there is some insulation so that oil prices and the way in which that impacts politics here at home are somewhat insulated.
Kaylee,
Dave,
very great to have you with us.
On that note, what are you expecting, just very quickly, Dave, on the energy-related stocks, the shipping-related counters in trade today as well?
Yeah, well, those two stories actually come together in one sector, right? Transport, airlines, in fact, very early. Auckland Airports is off 3 to 4%. Qantas is already down. That's really on flight cancellations, disruptions, and the move up in oil prices. So we're looking at that broad cohort of transport, airline, shipping-related names across the Asia-Pacific. Obviously, precious metals would be very much in focus today, given, of course, the pop we're seeing in precious metals. Just to note, in case your viewers are just joining us right now, U.S. futures are opening lower this Monday morning, and likely will be the case when you look at Japan. That comes online in about 15 minutes or so. Back to you guys.
China Show co-anchor David Inglis there, ahead of a very, very busy day for markets. At Bloomberg Balance of Power co-anchor Kaylee Lyons and our Deputy UAE Bureau Chief Abir Abu Omar there with the latest. Let's continue with this discussion with our next guest. Douglas Silliman is the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. He's also a former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Kuwait. Really great to have you with us. And I guess from the outset, I wanted to get your reactions as to how this played out, because in a lot of ways it was kind of very typical of a Donald Trump surprise. Even as these bilateral talks were still happening from Geneva, we're expecting more US-Iran talks going into this week. The strikes began to happen. Do you think that there is a plan for further objectives to be met? And what are those objectives when it comes to potential regime change?
Heidi, I think those are both very good questions. And I want to say thank you to all the viewers of Bloomberg TV. I'm very happy to be back on Bloomberg. I think one of the things that President Trump has got to define for himself, and preferably for the country as well, is the goals that he hopes to achieve in Iran. He has talked just in the past couple of days about regime change, about possible discussions with the remaining parts of the Iranian government. So it is very difficult for the Iranian side to actually understand what it is that President Trump is asking of them. I also fear that the Israeli government has a different set of goals for the operation in Iran. And I think there are many in the Israeli government who would prefer to see a collapse of the government and disarray in Iran as a way to postpone or do more damage to Iran's desire to destroy Israel in the long term. Maybe the most concerning for me is that I think now that the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has been killed in U.S. and Israeli airstrikes, you may see that the attitude and the goal of the remaining Iranian regime is to cause as much damage to the United States, to Israel, and potentially to the region as is possible. With the basic idea, if we are going down, we are going to take as many people down with us as we can, unless they can reestablish control across the country, which is probably what a lot of the people are thinking about doing right now at the top of the Iranian government.
We've talked about Iran really wanting to widen retaliation. We've also heard from Benjamin Netanyahu saying that Israeli strikes will intensify in the following days, and we're getting lines from the IDF at the moment, Douglas, commenting on projectiles in a Telegram post, really saying that they have seen things like sirens sounding out in Israel, projectiles being launched from Lebanon as well. How much risk do you assign regionally at this point when it comes to everything that's happening at the moment? And can any kind of cohesive way forward be shaped without further U.S. intervention? We know that there's not much appetite for boots on the ground, but do you see that as a risk going forward?
I see it as a risk, but with President Trump, probably a very small risk. I do not think he's going to want to put American boots on the ground in Iran. What I think is going to happen, and what you will see from the American and Israeli military in the coming days, is essentially circling around a whole set of different Iranian target sets: ballistic missile storage sites, ballistic missile launchers, drone storage sites, factories that make both command and control centers for the military, the Navy, the Revolutionary Guards. And it will be the responsibility of the American and the Israeli militaries, the air forces and the navies, to degrade these gradually. The real question is going to be who is going to run out of ammunition first. For Israel, for the Gulf states, they have taken a lot of Iranian rockets. The Emirati government, when they announced today that they were going to close their embassy in Tehran, said that Iran had fired 200 drones and 137 ballistic missiles at the UAE. The UAE had successfully countered most of them. But how much longer can this go on? How many more long-range, short-range ballistic missiles and drones does Iran have? How many can Israel and the United States degrade before they are fired? And how many more air defense munitions does Israel and do the GCC countries have to defend themselves against these huge salvos of rockets coming from Iran?
Ambassador, it seems like, to your point, the Iranian approach is to inflict as much damage as possible at this stage, even at the expense of all these other Gulf states that, in the first place, might not have wanted any military conflict. What are the risks for Iran strategically in such an approach in terms of further alienating some of these Gulf countries?
Well, if the main Israeli and American goal for this conflict is to achieve capitulation by the Iranian government, the risks to the Iranian government, the Islamic revolutionary government, are really quite small. If the goal is to get rid of them, there's probably very little that they can do to convince Israel or the United States to keep them in place. So I think that the strategy of maximum damage against particularly the United States in an election year, as was just discussed in your program, may be their best strategy to increase American popular opposition to the war. I think right now, and one of the things your reporter earlier mentioned that Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi mentioned that many units of the Iranian military and Revolutionary Guards were operating independently now based on instructions that were given to them a week, 2 weeks, 10 days ago. This shows, one, that I think they have lost a lot of their command and control, but two, you may see some attacks against civilian infrastructure, like the attacks against Duqm port in Oman, that were actually not intended at the beginning. Araghchi's comments were essentially an apology to Oman after Oman had mediated this last 2 rounds of talks. So I think it is going to be difficult for the Iranian regime to regain complete control of all of their military, but that is going to be one of their main goals going forward.
Douglas, I know that you said that the risk of boots on the ground, American boots on the ground, was low, but I'll put it to you this way. Do you think there can be meaningful regime change without that level of intervention?
Well, what is more important is, does Donald Trump believe that there can be meaningful regime change without boots on the ground? And the answer is, I frankly don't know. The pre-recorded message that he sent to the world and to the American people just as the attack started yesterday essentially said that he wanted the Iranian people to take regime change into their own hands, for them to get their country back. There does not appear to be much specific that the United States can do to help Iranians do that, other than to degrade the security services and their ability to prevent Iranians from going into the streets to protest. I will also notice that Iran is going to be very divided. You have seen in the past 24 hours both demonstrations mourning the death of Ayatollah Khamenei and demonstrations celebrating the death of the Ayatollah. I think Iran will be a very divided society, and it's a society in which it will be very difficult for a non-majority popular movement to take control of a government which still has all the guns in its hands.
Especially with these internet blackouts that we're hearing in the country, how do you organize an opposition? Ambassador, it's been great to chat. Thank you so much for your insights. Douglas Silliman is president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Kuwait. Quick look at markets. We're seeing oil suddenly catching a bid, jumping by the most in about 4 years, which was, of course, since the start of the war in Ukraine, although that 12-13% pop at the open is being pared back slightly on Brent crude futures. U.S. stock futures are down, gold also catching a bid. Now, as we unpack further the fallout from the Iran strikes, the Nuclear Threat Initiative warns that Washington will face many challenges in the coming weeks as a result of the war. One of the most consequential is the risk that Iran's nuclear materials and technology may no longer be secure if the regime collapses. Joining us now is the initiative's co-chair and former U.S. Energy Secretary, Ernest Moniz. Really good to see you. Ernest, first off, maybe talk to us about, when it comes to the events over the weekend, the death of the Ayatollah, the extent in which there not being any clear Iranian leadership at this stage, does it make things more dangerous as far as Iran's nuclear assets are concerned?
Well, I think there is an unfortunate likely retreat from any possibility of getting the international inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency back in the country. And that was certainly essential following the military activity of last June. I've said many times that, to me, I would be putting first priority on understanding the fate of the 60% enriched uranium. I think it has not been emphasized enough that that material actually could be directly used in a nuclear explosive device. We don't know where it is. It's thought that some of it certainly may still be deep in Isfahan, covered with rubble, but we also don't know if much of it was moved away. So I think a lot of the focus on enrichment is understandable, but if they have a lot of that 60% uranium still in their possession, presumably hidden somewhere, the reality is they could make a nuclear explosive without further enrichment. So I think that's number one. But number two is, clearly no one knows how this is going to end, really, or when it's going to end. But when it does, I think our priority has to be to get the IAEA, the international inspectors, back into Iran with the full set of tools that they had before President Trump tore up the JCPOA and Iran began to break out of the constraints of that agreement. We need to get back to the full set of tools of the IAEA and to add to it the cooperation of a future Iranian government in terms of understanding what's happened to the fissile material in the meantime, when the IAEA did not have eyes essentially on the nuclear enterprise.
And what is the worst case scenario and what's at stake here, given how there is a lot we still don't know, to your point, in terms of the possible proliferation of these nuclear assets and the role that non-state actors might actually play then?
Well, clearly, again, we don't know the future of the Iranian government, the regime. And by the way, I think it is as likely that we end up, frankly, with a military autocracy, the Revolutionary Guard, at least for some time. Now, the worst case scenario would appear to be that, first of all, materials, like I mentioned, the 60% uranium, have in fact been hidden away. There's, relatively speaking, chaos in the country, and trained scientists, nuclear scientists, with material start dispersing to other places. And then we would have a terrible situation on our hands in terms of possible terrorist activity, not only from Iran, but from other places which have taken control of those materials and have the knowledge base from those scientists. But we don't know. As I say, we're very early on in this military operation. We're very early on in terms of understanding the succession plan for the supreme leader, what the role of the Revolutionary Guard will be. We do know that the opposition does not appear to be well organized. As the ambassador said, is certainly not armed as far as we know. They have no charismatic leader. And so, as I say, anything is possible, including a possible ascendancy of the Revolutionary Guard, which would be exactly the opposite of what was intended.
Ernest, how much do we know about the third enrichment plant, and how much does the, obviously clandestine nature of how Natanz and Fordow were built tells us that potentially there's intelligence that we don't have at the moment in terms of what the capabilities and infrastructure remains?
Right. Well, Heidi, you're certainly correct that we don't really know what the situation is with possible deeply buried assets, deeply buried enrichment plants. I think we just don't know. But what we do know is that if Iran chooses to continue down the nuclear path, they will almost certainly go to increasing depths, increasing security for their enrichment facilities. Certainly, they have now seen 2 military operations directly against them, and I think we would have to assume that they will go to much more deeply buried sites.
Your point about the Revolutionary Guard is such a fascinating one, right? Do we assume that they sort of retain that level of loyalty to whoever replaces the supreme leader, or is there potentially going to be some tension there given different vested interests in that group, which is, of course, over the past decades really risen to a position of significant power?
Yeah, I think the words vested interests are quite appropriate. We should not forget that the Revolutionary Guard has some not precisely known, but some very, very major engagement in the Iranian economy. Frankly, a lot of the sanctions have even raised their stature in terms of the economy. For example, clearly Iran has continued to export about 1.5 million barrels of oil per day, much of it to China. And if anything, the Revolutionary Guard, precisely because it must be against the sanctions, has largely taken control of that. So the Revolutionary Guard, I think, is, they may have had, of course, some decapitation of their leadership, but I also think we don't understand in the West enough that Iran has built intentionally a pretty resilient system in terms of Plan B, Plan C, Plan D, and I'm sure there will be officers in the Revolutionary Guard who will want to maintain their strong advantage in terms of security and in terms of the economy and the financial resources that they have cornered, to be honest. And the real question is, will there be a cadre of Revolutionary Guard officers who take the opposite tack and who decide that they are willing to cooperate with the West to establish a country that is not, for example, spreading terror and security risk throughout the region. We don't know. Right now, I'd have to be honest and say that my bet would be that it will be very, very difficult to dislodge the Revolutionary Guard from a leadership role in the near term.
Ernest, as we speak, we are waiting for the U.S. president to also get off Air Force One. And as we watch these live pictures and perhaps any form of interaction from the president with the media, it's perhaps worth thinking about the justification for the strike on Iran in concert with Israel at this stage. I mean, coming into this weekend, what did we actually really know about the imminent nuclear threat that Iran actually posed?
Well, I don't believe there was any imminent threat, meaning very, very short-term threat, in any dimension that I can tell. Now, the president laid out what has been an almost 50-year history of, I would say, legitimate complaints on our side. But to be honest, I don't see any indication that Iran had, in a serious way, taken up the nuclear program again. They were continuing to work on their missile capabilities, and there's no doubt, I think, that that they are probably, let's say, nearly at least a decade away from having a very major ICBM-like capability, but they were working on it. Clearly, their proxies throughout the region have been largely degraded. Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis to a certain extent, Shia militias in Iraq, but they weren't eliminated. And if Iran does feel that they are existentially threatened, one could see them dialing up the pressure on their proxies as well to start creating more problems in the region. But I have certainly seen nothing that suggests that there was an imminent threat. So why the military action was taken exactly now is unclear. There are reports that, of course, the intelligence agencies had identified the meetings that were occurring with many high-level officials, including the supreme leader, as an opportunity. But then again, my understanding is that those were fairly regular meetings and did not have to trigger a military operation right now. So it seems to me it was more on the basis of long-standing issues, little progress, at least according to the administration, on the negotiations, on the nuclear negotiations. No progress, as far as I could tell, in terms of the missile front, and certainly with time, a slow rebuilding of their proxies and of their capabilities. So answer is, I don't see anything that would trigger a response, trigger a military operation immediately, but there were lots of signs that in the long term, this was going to drift back to a situation of heightened threat. And I go back to what I started with. I still feel very uncertain about what the fate of that 60% enriched material was, because to me, that is a very, very big deal.
And we just don't know its whereabouts at this stage, to your point. Thank you so much. Ernest Moniz is co-chair of the Nuclear Threat Initiative and former U.S. Secretary of Energy. Great to have you on the program today. Let's take another look at how commodities are faring. Brent continues pairing some of the early pop. Gold still catching a bit. U.S. stock futures are down 1%. Let's get the outlook for commodities now. Joining us is Jorge Leon. He is Senior Vice President and Head of Geopolitical Analysis at Rystad Energy. Jorge, always good to see you. Let's start off with the reaction function in Brent, because we did see, a spike in the initial stages, maybe a bit of a pairing now. How appropriately priced were energy markets for the strike over the weekend and the death of the Ayatollah, the concerns that maybe Iran could take the nuclear option and formally close the Strait of Hormuz?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Well, I was a bit surprised, actually, about the price reaction. My initial guess was that we were going to see prices, Brent at least, above 85, closer to $90 per barrel. We've seen now that the price is around $79, $80 per barrel. That's close to a 10% increase. But one thing I think is important to remember, just a couple of months ago, before the tension with Iran started, prices were below $60 per barrel. So that really means that with all the Iranian tension, prices have increased 30% in just a couple of months. But I think that the market needs to keep a close eye on what happens in the Strait of Hormuz. I think that's the key to fully understand the scope of this crisis.
So when you talk about the scope, if they formally close the Strait of Hormuz, are we going to see Brent at 100 or maybe even beyond that?
Well, I guess it depends on the duration of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Right now, all traffic is halted. Now, around 15 million barrels per day of crude passes through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. There are some options to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia has the East-West pipeline, who can export 4 million barrels per day. The UAE also has the Abu Dhabi pipeline, that can bypass the Strait of Hormuz. But in reality, it would be impossible to offset the full 15 million barrels per day. Now, let's also not forget the global market dynamics. We're in a year of global oil oversupply, so that also pushes limits a little bit the upside price pressure. But if we are looking into a scenario where there continues and longer disruption to the Strait of Hormuz for more than a few days towards weeks or months, then we're definitely seeing a scenario possible of $100 per barrel.
Can OPEC Plus also cushion a lot of that as well, with flexibility on how much they release onto the market? We're hearing that they'll probably do more.
Heidi, I think that's a great question. I don't think that there are many levers that OPEC Plus can pull. Let's not forget that OPEC Plus can decide to increase production more than anticipated. Before the events over the weekend, OPEC Plus decided, or partially decided, to increase production by 137 kbd. At the end, they increased a bit more, 206,000 barrels per day. But in reality, the problem is that most of those additional barrels need to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. So in reality, the impact of additional OPEC Plus in production hikes might be actually very, very limited.
I wanted to take a look at a chart showing tanker rates that have been moving steadily higher as well. How much buffer do you see in this pricing? Again, I understand it's unknown territory. It depends on the duration of these disruptions. But is there less buffer when it comes to tanker rates?
I think there's less buffer for sure. And again, it all goes back on what happens in the Strait of Hormuz. And I really want to differentiate between two scenarios. One scenario is the actual closure of the Strait of Hormuz by Iran, the military actions in the Strait of Hormuz. And the other very important scenario is where ship owners just completely, for precautionary reasons, stop passing through the Strait of Hormuz. In reality, the impact of both the scenarios in the oil market is actually the same. And let's not forget another important element here, that even if situations de-escalate sometime in the next few days, reopening the Strait of Hormuz will take a few days, if not weeks. So I don't think we're looking into a scenario that could be easily resolved, let's say, in the next week or two, in the best case scenario.
Okay, what do we know about Iran's exports then, if there's so much uncertainty and instability in the region? Can it really be business as usual? And then for the likes of China, for example, does that mean also turning more to the likes of Russia for energy?
That's a great question. Let's not forget that almost all of the Iranian exports flow to China, 1.5 million barrels per day. And at the moment, those flows have stopped because of the lack of transit in the Strait of Hormuz. So for China, probably the best option that they have is to try to tap more into the Russian flows, given particularly now that the Russian exports to India are coming down. And also important to remember that China has been very wisely stockpiling a lot of crude last year, so they have a big buffer to overcome the current crisis.
As we've been speaking, we've been seeing the U.S. president descending the stairs of Air Force One and walking there on the tarmac at Joint Base Andrews. Jorge, I wonder, what does the role of the U.S. supply perhaps play against the backdrop of this spike in oil prices? Are we likely to see it tapping into its SPRs, especially in a year where higher pump prices might actually turn into an election issue in the midterms?
I think this is one of the few levers that the market has, particularly in the U.S. and in the OECD. Right now, the U.S. has 415 million barrels of SPRs, much lower than what we had before the Russia-Ukraine war, which were around 700 million barrels. So the scope is less. But if this is an extended crisis, and if we see prices spiking for a sustained period of time, then really the only lever that the U.S. and the West world has is to tap into the SPRs. That would be an emergency situation. But clearly, this looks like a textbook example of an energy crisis. So it will be, in my opinion, very well justified.
Jorge, really great to have you with us. Jorge Leon, who's a Senior Vice President and Head of Geopolitical Analysis at Rystad Energy. Take a look at the movers, and there's no surprises that we're seeing some pricing moves when it comes to Australian energy shares. Some of the first companies really to react to the disruptions to the Strait of Hormuz, as well as broader oil prices under pressure as well. Perhaps not as much as we were expecting, but we are seeing upside when it comes to Santos and Woodside Energy. We know that LNG is going to see some big disruptions too, again, depending on how long this conflict goes on for. We're seeing Korean Energy up by 15% there, and Beach Energy also up by close to 9%. The other sectors that we're watching, airlines, aviation, obviously a key one that's really getting that double whammy, not just because we're seeing these airspace disruptions causing huge amounts of flight cancellations and rerouting, flights being grounded as well and being sent back. We're also seeing the impact of potential higher oil prices. Qantas there dropping by 1.9%. We're off those session lows at the moment. That was the lowest in about 10 months. We're seeing huge surges when it comes to trading volumes as well. But the prospect of $100 for jet fuel, some of that further pressure from airspace, pressures, $80 oil, really threatening some of these Asian airlines that are unhedged when it comes to oil prices there. Drones, also one to watch in the sector. We're seeing upside of as much as 12% at one point for Drone Shield trading here in Sydney. You can take a look at the live streaming news and interviews as this breaking story continues. Bloomberg TV shows, documentaries, reporter analysis and more are all in one place. You can check it out at bloomberg.com/videos. This is Bloomberg.
World's most powerful investors don't ring a bell. They quietly reshape entire industries. This is the money shaping the world. The Dealmaker Playbook, where power and billions of dollars change hands every day. From private equity and credit to venture capital and M&A, we bring you the inside scoop on the biggest deals and debates, plus exclusive conversations with finance's ultimate insiders. I'm Danny Berger, and this is Bloomberg Deals. Every week, only on Bloomberg Television.
Why do the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg Television?
That's a great question.
It's a very good question.
Interesting question. Good question. Great question. I so appreciate that question. You certainly ask interesting questions.
Bloomberg Television. Top experts, great questions. U.S. jobs numbers are released. Bloomberg has the report under surveillance with crucial data and expert analysis at terminal speed. Nobody covers Jobs Day like Bloomberg.
Take a look at what we're watching when it comes to markets at the moment, coming online and really getting that first reaction to the US-led attacks on Iran. And we continue to watch that in terms of further retaliation, further strikes from Israel. And really, the key question is to the duration of this conflict. That's going to have major implications for how much we see that haven bid still continuing to play out, how much we see that surge in oil and energy assets and energy shares, as well as some of those tanker prices, for example, also spiking with these disruptions to the Strait of Hormuz, and how elongated that disruption really is going to be. When it comes to Japanese stocks, where they've been kind of seen lower at this point, really equity investors looking like across the region we're going to see some defensive plays, despite, of course, when it comes to Japan, a weak again is at play there. We're looking for Japan as well, that exposure to any disruption to LNG prices and supply. We've already seen that play out for some of the Australian players like Santos and Woodside this morning. That could also be a short-term drag on the economy, not to mention, of course, potentially the implications for inflation globally. We'll also be watching some of those tech and AI-specific names as well, Avril, with, of course, some of the drone names, defense names, keenly in focus today.
Yeah, as we watch the market reaction, we're also watching out for China's reaction. It's criticized the U.S. and Israeli attacks on Iran, warning they risk plunging the Middle East into deeper instability and undermining international law. Let's bring in our China correspondent, Mimin Lo in Beijing. So, Mimin, walk us through China's response.
Yeah, China's response has been swift but measured. We have the Chinese Foreign Ministry putting out a statement soon after the conflict saying that this attack on Iran is an attack on its sovereignty and calling for a ceasefire, calling for a return to dialogue. And these are very predictable lines that we hear time and again, even during the 12-day war last year as well. But interestingly, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi had a phone call with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian Foreign Minister, yesterday. These two members of the UN National Security Council having an emergency phone call, and you can see on the screen that he said that it is unacceptable for the US and Israel to attack Iran to try to incite regime change, and that the conflict could spill over into the greater region and push the Middle East into a dangerous abyss. And I think it's interesting to pay attention to what Wang Yi said, particularly about inciting regime change, because many analysts have been saying that the top priority for China is to ensure stability. So it will be watching very closely for any emergence of a new power in Iran to ensure that that new regime will not be closely aligned with the United States. And it's also interesting that this conflict is already pushing China and Russia closer together. The two foreign ministers speaking, both of them aligned in this view that Iran has been an important counterbalance to the US.
President Xi and Trump are supposed to meet at the summit potentially end of the month or early April. This further complicates the agenda, doesn't it?
Yeah, of course, and this has really been at the crux of the matter, right? It's just a couple of weeks from now, President Trump is expected to travel to Beijing to meet with President Xi. We haven't heard from either countries whether or not this summit is going to be postponed or cancelled given the latest developments, but still analysts are saying that we now have to pare back our expectations as to what could realistically be achieved in that summit. But also bear in mind, yes, China and Iran have a close relationship, but China is far more important to Iran than Iran is to China. Yes, China buys a lot of Iranian oil, but all in, it only constitutes about 13% or so of China's total oil imports by sea. And some analysts are saying that Iran simply is not a big enough or important enough interest for China to sacrifice its relations with the United States, because I think China still wants to ensure that trade truce remains in place to protect its economic interests, given we are now in a week when China's top leaders and the national parliament will be meeting to discuss the next 5-year plan for the country. And so they will want to ensure that tariffs remain low. And yes, the US Supreme Court has struck down those tariffs, but remember, the Trump administration has been still looking for alternative ways to raise tariffs on China, whether it's Section 301 or Section 232. So that is still going to be the main priority for the Chinese government.
Bloomberg's Mimin Lo there in Beijing. Well, in terms of regional reactions, of course, we've seen some measured words from Canberra over the weekend. Japan's government has so far refrained from voicing full support for the US-led attacks on Iran. Kyodo reporting that Prime Minister Takaichi has asked for analysis on the potential economic and logistical impacts. Let's take a look at the outlook when it comes to what we're expecting. Jesper Cole, who's an expert director at Monex Group, joins us now. So Jesper, first of all, let me get sort of your broader reaction to what we've seen. Of course, almost everyone that we've spoken to says it really does depend on how long this continues for, right? How long this war or conflict is extended. How do you view, I guess, the economic and the geopolitical risks here?
Look, I mean, there's an enormous amount of uncertainty because you're basically poking a hornet's nest with the attacks on all the surrounding countries, and we just simply don't know, what the duration, is going to be, plus the complication of the regime change. And of course, more pertinent, and this is not just for Japan, but for everybody, if you do get a genuine oil shock, which is to say over the next, not just couple of days, but really over the next couple of months, oil trading around $100, $120, that would, of course, have significant implications, in terms of not just inflation, but really here in Japan, putting the agenda of Prime Minister Takaichi at risk, because she has promised the Japanese people that she would bring energy and food inflation down. So the war in Iran immediately, if there is long duration, causes a big problem.
Yes, but what do you see as being the inflation issue, which of course is front and center for the Bank of Japan?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's very simple. If you do the maths, if oil trades, around $100, $110 for the next couple of months, you're adding back almost 0.5% to Japanese consumer price inflation. And that's obviously a supply shock. Which is to say that the Bank of Japan hiking interest rates is actually the wrong policy measure. You would actually want to get some income support, another fiscal package, which also Prime Minister Takaichi doesn't really want to do. So we shall see. Lots of uncertainty here, but the good news is that in terms of the domestic animal spirits, restarting the domestic nuclear energy supply, the civilian use of nuclear power, building up more resilient supply chains, that sort of business investment here in Japan is already very strong. And I think that the crisis in the Middle East, is going to make that even stronger. In Japan, for Japan, that's where Japanese companies are going to be investing.
Yeah, not to mention at a time where Japan's defense spending has been on the up. Jesper, we're hearing about how the UAE Foreign Ministry is summoning the Iranian ambassador over these attacks. I mean, the worry of the regional conflict being more widespread and more protracted, to your point earlier. But I wonder, given the uncertainties, the instability, what are you seeing in terms of Japanese assets and the allure from investors as traditional havens? We know how that relationship for the yen, that's been tested. For JGBs, that seems to be trickling back in. What are you seeing?
Look, I think that, you would see, number one, the outlook for the dollar remains a very constructive one. And obviously, if oil prices go higher, that generates additional incremental demand for the dollar. I think that Japanese domestic investors, continuing to actually recycle the big current account surplus, buying global assets, particularly U.S. assets, that's going to be going forward. It was interesting. There was a beginning of some new capital flows from Japan into the People's Republic of China over the last couple of months. Obviously, China is also at risk from higher energy prices. So it'll be interesting to see whether a preference for America versus China is going to reassert itself.
Yes, but always great to chat with you. Jesper Kohl is an expert director at Monex Group. Well, the conflict in Iran has thrown global air travel into chaos, with airspace closed over the region and major hubs in Dubai, Doha, Abu Dhabi suspending operations. Bloomberg's Paul Allen joins us now with more. So it's really this double whammy, oil prices as well as the disruption to flights that we're seeing.
Yeah, that's right. The whole situation is in flux, and already we've seen significant disruption. I mean, there were strikes over the weekend at airports at Abu Dhabi. One person killed by shrapnel there. The details are a little bit hazy. Dubai Airport, I mean, this is an area you'd normally think was safe. It was hit by a missile over the weekend, injuring 4 people. So this is the world's busiest international airport. We've had 1,200 flights cancelled now. The UAE Civil Aviation Authority saying 20,000 passengers have been impacted. Now, that seems a little conservative in many requests. That airport sometimes handles up to 10,000 passengers per hour, 95 million passengers in the past year. So the upheaval is going to be huge. And, of course, it ripples out because there's this complex global choreography around flights of planes and crews are not in the right place at the right time. There's a tremendous knock-on effect. So we're seeing delays in places like India, Canada, Europe. Here in Australia, the government's warned to expect travel disruption over the coming days. And already we're seeing this reflected in the Qantas share price, which I know you'd mentioned earlier, off at 9% at one point. Trading volume really heavy. I think it's now off about 6%. But other stocks as well. The Flight Centre's been impacted. We heard from Qantas in a statement saying there has been currently no impact, but it's got a code share agreement with Emirates. The share price is down seems a little optimistic.
Every time you talk to an airline CEO, I think your second question is probably on hedging oil prices, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Bloomberg Intelligence has been running some analysis on this as well. And if you work on the assumption that jet fuel prices hit $100 a barrel or north of that, well, it's the hedged carriers that come out of this okay, and those include Qantas, Singapore Airlines, Japan Airlines, ANA, Cathay. They're better positioned to weather this impact. The big three airlines in China, none of them are hedged. Indigo in India also not hedged, and the rupee is very, very weak. So Indigo is going to be an interesting stock to watch when we get to the open in India as well, particularly if this drags on and fuel prices go beyond that potential $100 a barrel level.
Bloomberg's Paul Allen there. One to watch, Avro, as we head into the Open in India today.
And as we speak, we're hearing how the IDF is starting an additional wave of strikes in Tehran, continuing those strikes on those targets in the country. No letting up when it comes to military action in Iran. We're looking at Nikkei futures, Topix futures pointing to steep declines at the open, but in terms of sectors that could see a bit of trading the other direction, energy shippers as well. The yen is losing ground, perhaps those concerns about higher oil prices. JGB futures, that's interesting in how it's been catching a bit. Is it safe haven allure returning, especially following on from the ructions we saw earlier in the year that have more or less been allayed? We'll check the markets open in Tokyo next. This is Bloomberg.
This is a 15, 16 grams tuna. Then sushi rice is still a little bit warm. So take one, like a very, don't make it too tight. So from now, and very light, like a ball. Put wasabi in the middle. Then my process 1 to 6. 1. This is putting the between the rice air. Then make the 4 fingers curl. Make sushi shape. Then touch this. 2. Then turn. Now that these 2 fingers, top to the bottom, make the sushi shape more beautiful. 3. Then, I'm not, looks like pushing, not pushing. 3, 4, turn, same way, 5, and 6. So this is the 1 to 6.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm David Gurr.
I'm Lisa Mateo. And I'm Christina Ruffini. We're tracking breaking news today from Wall Street to Washington. Let's start overseas. The sector is really propelling this deal forward.
Yeah, the hope is this will open up new markets and provide some additional liquidity.
Of course, now they're going to have competitors. We got a big week coming up in politics.
Earnings season is underway. We're going to get some key reports.
Everything you need to know before the markets open on Monday.
Introducing Bloomberg This Weekend, bringing a little Bloomberg into your weekend routine.
Guys, buckle up.
Key investors, top executives, global innovators. Join me for in-depth conversations with the biggest newsmakers on the day's top stories. Insight with Haslinda Anand, only on Bloomberg.
It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. ETF IQ, only on Bloomberg.
This is the Asia Trade. We're counting down to Asia's major market opens. Well, Korea gets a bit of respite, April, as we head into what is undoubtedly going to be a frenetic trading week. So much of this will come back to how much pressure we see on the upside when it comes to energy prices, crude prices. Clearly, we've seen that reaction, the haven bid when it comes to gold, treasury, sovereign bonds playing out. But the question is the duration of this conflict with Israel and the US and Iran, and how long it goes on for will really inform